speakers. You can you've seen them on the website. Amanda Beamer and Cheryl Ball. They were colleagues at Utah State University when they started this work. And so we have kind of 3 points in the agenda, 4 points. They're going to talk about what happened at the institutional level, how writing professors get together and kind of work with each other and get support from colleagues to advance their dream about what a writing space should be like, recognizing that learning spaces are places in which people practice to becoming a professional in the field. And then, like many of you on the call who've gone through this process of planning how the space evolved, how they assessed and engaged students in the assessment, and what impact that has meant on them professionally and on the national community, and then some of the lessons learned. And so I'm going to give you a little bit of the instructions for those of you who have been with us often. You know about that Jennifer will have us all muted so there's no conflict or confusion with ambient noise. If you have a question that you'd like to ask or raise in the course of their discussion, you can type it into the chat room and we will hold the question until they have 4 points times in their discussion when there will be opportunities to ask questions, or you can raise your hand, and then if it's an urgent question that's relevant right at that point, then we will let you join the conversation then. And so we have 4 learning goals. And it's interesting how strikingly similar these learning goals are for each of the classrooms that we have had webinars on and that we've explored in other ways in our Learning Spaces Collaboratory. User-centered design, that you're supporting team-based learning, and this value of iterative planning, piloting, and assessing, that there's always, that at this stage in our exploration of what kind of learning spaces work best, we are all kind of pioneers and explorers. And to have our students become, and in this case, they wanted their students to understand how writing happened in the real world. So I think now, Amanda, you want to start the story?
Sounds good to me. Thanks, Jeannie. So the Sweet Lab at Utah State University, in order to really understand how that lab works and what we went through to get that redesigned, we really have to sort of talk about the history of it really quickly. First of all, it's a departmentally owned space. That means that the English department essentially owns the lab. We run it, we pay for all the fees, and that primarily it's our students who use it, students who are in English classes, not just English majors. So that's also first-year composition students, for instance, or students who come from, say, engineering over to take a tech writing class. Now, the lab really is 30 years old, the English department lab. Started in 1983, back when computers were first being seen as something we could use as a tool for writing. In 1990, it moved over to the Ray B. West building, which is where the English department at Utah State lives now. And at that time, the department had no say in the design of that space at all. We were mostly designing the space to protect the computers because computers were expensive. And, well, they still are, but back then they were even more expensive. So we had them all up against the wall so we wouldn't be able to knock them over and that sort of thing. In 1995, we moved the lab from the 4th floor of the building down into the basement. And at this point, it's important to realize that the Ray B. West building was built in 1918. And so the basement of a building from 1918 leaves some things to be desired, ultimately. And in 2005, we managed to procure some new to us furniture from the library, which Cheryl will talk about a bit more later. And in 2007, we got the money to redesign that lab into what we call the Sweet Lab. And so in this next picture here, you can see what the lab space looked like right before we redesigned it. And it has sort of this industrial aesthetic that, Cheryl, do you want to talk more about that industrial aesthetic?
Yeah, that'd be great. Let's see. So to give you a little bit more context about, can you all hear me okay? I hope so. To give you a little bit more context about the lab space. I was hired with my colleague Ryan Moeller in 2004 as a brand new tenure-track faculty member into the English department to do work in rhetoric and technology. The department didn't have a lot of technology, as you can see. They just had some older Dell machines, but they wanted to do this kind of work. They hired us to do more multimodal work, more digital work, but it wasn't really ever our plan to redo the lab. That just kind of happened as a part of it. In the lab space, they had old chairs, they were falling apart, and everything was real crunched together. Literally in one of the classrooms that's next door to this lab picture that I'm showing here, I would have to crawl over students to get to other students because the space was so tight. It was pretty embarrassing, actually. But I found out through the grapevine in early 2006 that the library across campus was being torn down because they were building a new library on a different part of the campus. And as part of the tear down, they were getting rid of 200 computer chairs that the library was using in their lab. So I grabbed a whole class full of students and asked them to come with me to the library, and we wheeled these chairs across the campus in order to put them in our computer labs in the Ravy West building. It was our hopes that these chairs that were new to us would improve the space, and they are these blue chairs that you see in this picture. But as you can see, things are still pretty overcrowded, and it just wasn't a very good reflection of our pedagogy at the time. So in May of 2006, the department chair came to my colleague Ryan and I and asked us to submit a grant that the provost had put together. It was called an innovation grant, where we would create student-focused projects. The lab space was the thing that immediately came to our minds because this was a space that the students used primarily. There was some teaching that went on, but we knew that we would only have the money. There were two rooms. One of them was a classroom and one of them was the open lab space. And we would only have the money to do the open lab space, which would affect more students coming through, including all of the first-year composition students that Amanda had mentioned. So we ended up writing this innovation grant. We overwrote. It was both our first time writing a grant. So we wrote like 40 pages of justification for why the English department needed this new lab space and how it would change the pedagogy. So as part of doing that, we ended up that we wrote these 40 pages that we didn't need, and so we ended up only submitting one page of the grant to the provost's office, which was successful. And it was about almost $100,000 in funding in order to redo that grant, to redo that lab space. We got the funding in the fall of 2006 for the Suite Lab. And we called it the Suite Lab because originally we had planned to do a series of rooms together, like the classroom space, and we would put a multimedia center in next door, but we could only get funding for one room. So the Suite Lab ended up being this name that we didn't necessarily follow through with in the original conception of the space, but we did with what we were able to do. It took us a year to plan that physical space, in part from our experience in working in other labs. I'd worked at 2 other labs at prior institutions, and I had redesigned one of those labs already. So I came with that knowledge and knew that in order to implement the mobile and professionally based pedagogy that we wanted to do, that it would take us a while to really think about what we wanted, what we wanted in the space, what the furniture would be like. And as you can see, we've got a whole range of kinds of furniture that we're going to talk a little bit more about in the next section. But through the years, the space has evolved. That's one of the important things to consider. Just as Amanda and I are no longer at Utah State, Amanda was a graduate student when this project started, so she's moved on into her first tenure track job, and I've moved on to another school where I've since designed 3 more labs. There were a lot of choices that went into the decision in 2006 that then subsequently changed as the needs for the room also changed. I think Amanda next is going to talk about what some of these big picture goals are.
Thanks, Cheryl. So yeah, big picture goals for Room 101, which is the open access, or I'm sorry, the open lab space for the Suite Lab. So at this point, some people on campus might have been wondering, why was it even important for English professors to redesign their lab anyway in the first place? Well, we felt that it was very important. I mean, the English department on many campuses is seen as sort of this poor department. We don't have a lot of high-tech resources, we don't have high cash flow. And so we wanted to basically have a better image on campus. That was partially part of our goal. But more importantly, we wanted our students to be able to experience writing like they would be able to on the job, because that would better prepare them for writing in the workplace and getting jobs. And really, collaborative writing is how writing takes place in the workplace. And so we were teaching collaborative writing, definitely, in our classes, but our spaces just weren't supporting it. And partially they weren't supporting it physically, but they also weren't supporting it very well visually. And it's important to remember that a large part of our audience was transient. So for instance, English students would be in one English class during the entirety of their university career, for instance. So they'd only be using the lab one semester. So this was our chance to really visually reinforce the collaborative nature of writing. When they weren't in our classroom and they were using the lab, they would still be getting this idea in their head. And maybe more importantly is that collaborative writing in a diverse English department, which is what Utah State English department is like. We have creative writing, many types of literature, professional writing, and a few graduate programs. Collaborative writing was one area that the whole department could agree on, and you can probably imagine how important that would be to us then, to be able to come together on this one ideal of how our writing should be represented. And so the real question then became, how do we visually portray collaborative writing? And Cheryl, what do you think about that?
Well, one of the things that we wanted to do was take the concept of a rhetoric of design, a rhetoric of space, and institute that in the space itself. We knew that collaborative writing is the way that most writing happens in the world. That's just based on the research that Writing Studies has done for the last 30 or 40 years. We also knew that that space means something just as written text does. So thinking about the physical space as a type of text was an important part of our theoretical goals for the Suite Lab redesign. We were drawing on sort of three kinds of theories that I've listed here. Multimodality or multimodal theory simply is a theoretical construct that written text isn't the only way to communicate in the world, that we communicate through spatial and gestural and visual and oral ways of communicating as well, and that all of those have a certain impact on the user or the reader. We also knew, based on work from multiliteracies pedagogies, that it was really important to be able to teach students how to compose in modes like visual and oral and spatial, not just in written text. And so we wanted the space to be able to enact that pedagogy through its physicality, through the furniture and the colors and the computers and whatnot. And some of you may be familiar with Gardner's work on multiple intelligences, where everybody has like sort of different learning styles, and that was definitely connected to the work of multiliteracies and multimodalities. And we were using all of that to sort of to frame our goals for the lab, in that we wanted it to be mobile and informal, kind of like an internet cafe space, if you will, which in 2006 was pretty innovative, like in an English department, certainly. Now you see a lot more spaces like that, and we'll show some pictures of it later. But it was very important for the English department to be able to model the space as a space for collaborative writing, particularly when there were no other spaces that supported this kind of work in our department and very few on campus. In the next section, we're going to go into some more of the details for the goals of the lab, but we're going to stop here momentarily to take any questions that y'all might have.
Okay, this is Jeannie. Are there any questions? I don't see any typed in.
I can type some in if you have any. Like, why'd you leave Utah State?
Well, well I left Utah State because I had done the work that I needed to do there. It was a great first job, but I went to Illinois State because I wanted to work in a PhD program in multimodal composition.
Other
I left
questions?
Utah State because I graduated, if anyone wants to know.
Talk a little bit more about the rhetoric of space. This is kind of when I first found you people on the web that really intrigued me, that spaces could say something to the user.
Yeah. There's this theorist, Günter Kress, who is based out of London. I think he's at the University of London. He writes a lot about space and uses examples of it in his books. And one of the examples that he uses that I like a lot is when he goes into there's this building called the Senate building at his university. And if you can imagine, in London, it is this very prestigious, grand, tall stone building. And, we've seen buildings like this all over campuses and in our downtown areas and whatnot. And they have a certain, they make us, stand a certain way. They make us act a certain way just because of the architecture of the space. And so that's kind of what we mean. When you walk into a building and it signals to you a certain level of formality or a certain tone or a certain way of being in that space, as opposed to going into a coffee shop or going into somebody's home, and whether that home is kept well or not kept well, like all of those things signal to you as a participant in that space how you should read the space and how you should react to it. Does that make sense?
Perfect. I don't see any questions, so you can proceed.
Okay, great. So in the next section, we're talking a little bit more about the goals and, about how we set up how we set up the lab. Like I said before, I had worked by the time I got to Utah State, that was my third lab space that I had worked in. And I want to talk for a second about the lab that I'd worked in prior to that. When I was still a graduate student, I was getting my PhD at Michigan Technological University, which is in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. It's an incredibly remote place, 12 hours northwest of Detroit, if you can imagine that. And it was a very, very cold place. They get 300 inches of snow a year. And so a sense of community was a very important part of the lab space that I worked in up there. And again, that space was called the the Center for Computer Assisted Language Instruction. We called it the CCLI. And Dr. Dickie Self ran that lab, and I was his assistant for a year or two. While I was there, this lab, the CCLI, was considered the premier lab, digital humanities lab in the United States. It was one of the earliest ones. They started, I think, in 1980. They started before personal computers, so I think it was in 1982, and then they got networked computers in 1983. And the history of writing instruction and computers and writing instruction does date back even to mainframe computers. So this is a very long-standing tradition in writing studies. While I was working at the CCLI, we redesigned the lab again, and one of the faculty members there, Ann Wysocki, was partly responsible for the redesign, and she made sure that we already had pod arrangements, which I'll show you in a second. But we drew on her expertise as an artist and adding color to the space, all the things that I brought with me as we redesigned the lab at Utah State. So with that sort of as my background, I knew historically that writing programs had a very rich history of using computer labs. I wanted to make sure that the Suite Lab would merge the professional writing practices and academic writing practices with the literature that we knew was successful about lab design. And so working from this vision and the research that we knew about, we wanted to make this team-based space. Part of what informs the history of labs, of computer labs in writing programs, are these different kinds of layouts that you'll see. For instance, like in the upper right-hand corner, you have the pod arrangement, which is a newer arrangement, and it's a pretty experimental one still, even though labs like the CCLI have been using it for 15 or 20 years. More traditionally, and what we don't even have pictured here, are the rows, where the teacher's at the front of the room and you have straight rows going all the way back to the end of the room. And sometimes there might be 50 or 60 computers in that room just sort of crammed in. Or you might have a perimeter arrangement, like the lower left-hand corner picture shows, where the teachers or the instructors are at the front of the room and then the students are around the edges of the room. All of these different models imply a certain kind of pedagogy. And while originally the lab at Utah State wanted to use the perimeter arrangement, it also needed to account when classes would meet in that room. So I think our classes were capped at 25. And so we needed to cram 25 computers into, plus an instructor station, into this room that really could handle about 18 desktops, which is why those early pictures that we showed you were so crammed. So when we were redesigning and thinking about how we might lay out the Suite Lab, we were definitely thinking about pods, because pods get to the collaborative nature of writing. And this was one of our early layouts that we were playing around with here, where you can see we have the couch area set up in the corner, and at the bottom right-hand area we were envisioning a multimedia station with one of the more higher-end computers, and then having pod arrangements in the middle there. So at this point, Amanda is going to tell you a little bit more about the details of how we actually envisioned setting up the lab, including she's going to give you a little bit more detail about some of the bigger picture stuff that we had to think about. We were in this old room, like she said. We had old electrical that we were dealing with, the limited space. We had bulwarks and columns and stuff that we had to work around. And of course, we had limited budget and personnel to deal with. So Amanda, do you want to take over that?
Excellent, sounds good to me. So the first thing, one of our first goals we wanted to foster for the space was mobility, and it seems sort of obvious now when we think back to it, but mobility, and this means a lot of things, because you can't just think about mobility by being laptops that you can move around, because yes, that's great, but if there's no space for people to move around in what really was a pretty small space to turn into a lab, it's maybe, I guess, I don't remember the exact square footage of it. Maybe Cheryl, do you by chance?
Yeah, no.
It's maybe the size of 2 regular classrooms, maybe?
Yeah.
I'd say that. So it wasn't a huge space. And it wasn't originally a computer lab either. I mean, back in 1918, we didn't have computer labs. So we need to think about how can we arrange chairs so that they're not in the way of students, because we want students to be able to be mobile too. And we also have to think about, well, handicapped people, wheelchairs. How can they get into some of these spaces? So we need to leave big enough spaces. And so we have things like mobile furniture. All of those couch-like chairs you see in this picture, it's not as obvious, but we also had casters for these so that we could put wheels on them. And we eventually did put wheels on all of these couch-like chairs. This picture is from before then. And you can see the the chairs at the desktops. Yeah, they're normal computer chairs that wheel around. And also mobility-wise, and you can see it better in this other picture, we have desktops that are there just so that people can be mobile. Now, if we think about this, some people come to the lab for one specific purpose. They just want to print. That's all they want to do. They don't even really want to take time to sit down to do it. So we made these little kiosk stations that we called print and go stations. Those that were intended for people just to jump in, print their paper, 5 minutes before class, which is when they usually do it, and then go to class. And so we had to think about that. Mobility was also students, but also computers. And you see in this picture, we have Macs. This was a bloody decision that we came to. Lots of fighting over whether we do Macs or PCs. At the time, we chose Macs because they had more functionality than PCs, They could run the Windows operating system and the Mac OS. And also lots of our students, well, the professional writing students would be, some of them would be going into jobs where they'd be doing some design work, and so Macs would be more common then. However, we also got some student negative feedback on this decision, which we'll talk about more later when we talk about student feedback. And you'll notice that we have desktops and laptops because they both serve important functions. I mean, I mentioned disabled students earlier. Well, some students need larger screens to be able to even see things. And we have a lot of non-traditional students at Utah State. So we ended up with 26 laptops and 13 desktops, which is roughly equivalent to how many desktop computers we had in the room before, because the laptops are so much smaller. And it's important to note in this space that Utah State is sort of in a unique position. Logan, Utah was just ranked as the safest city, I think, in America. And theft is very uncommon there. We did have things to lock down the laptops, but we rarely used them. We only used them in the beginning when we had to set the laptops out so that our students would know, hey, there's laptops. But we have, in my history there, nobody had ever stolen a laptop. So after computers, we have furniture. You can see our furniture here. You can also see that the labs, this picture was taken later after Cheryl and I moved on in our careers, that the lab has updated to have PCs now. And I'm not sure how they came to that decision, but I'm sure there was some logic behind there. And so furniture, you can see our wheeled chairs and our tables that are pretty small, so they're pretty light and easy to move, those little round cylinder tables, which is big enough for a laptop. We tested that. And we chose that furniture based on mobility, but also because, well, you'll notice it's kind of fun looking, right? If we're going for internet cafe, if we're going for not being the common lab experience, we needed to make it look different. And so color was one of the ways we did that. And I'll talk about that more in a minute. And finally, when we were choosing our furniture, we discovered that we ended up picking the fabric that they often choose for hospitals because it's very easy to clean. And we did not have a rule about no eating in the lab, which meant that we sometimes had to wipe things up. Well, even when you have rules about no eating in the lab, students still sometimes eat in the lab. So it was important for us to be able to wipe off these chairs and tables when necessary, which was necessary maybe once or twice a week. And so going back to color, which is one of the ways that we really pushed back against this lab ideology of the lab as a place where you as a student come and you work by yourself and you're very, very quiet and nobody looks at your computer screen and you don't look at anyone else's and you're all by yourself. Well, when you think to common lab designs nowadays, lots of labs are gray or white. They're sort of drab looking. One of the students in one of our times we were getting student feedback described it as sort of prison-like, like what you would imagine a computer lab in a prison would look like. They have nice little partitions for each station so that people can't touch each other, and they're gray. And so one of the ways we worked against that was really just painting, which sounds really simple, and well, it really was simple. And we know it worked because we got a lot of student reactions that showed us and also told us that it worked. For instance, when we first opened the lab, many students would show up, look in the door, and then turn around and leave. And eventually, once we realized we needed to chase these people down and figure out why they were leaving, because there couldn't have been that many people who were just lost on campus, we found out that they didn't realize that this lab was a computer lab. Our internet cafe apparently worked a little too well. They thought it was a student lounge, and they assumed there was a student lounge they weren't allowed to be in for whatever reason. They didn't realize they could do their work in there. So we trained our lab cons to basically show our students and respond to this student reaction. Then they tell them, hey, you can come in here. This is for you too. And Cheryl, do you want to talk some more about personnel and lab cons?
Yeah, sure. So
I mentioned earlier how Ryan and I had had many conversations with the IT staff about our pedagogy and how we wanted to use these labs as teaching spaces as well as open lab spaces that would work for the students. But one of the important things for us was to have these lab consultants who were students, who were also students, you know, working in the lab and modeling this more informal behavior for other students who wanted to use the lab. And by informal, I mean, like, I remember my first time going into a computer lab. I think it was 1990 or something. And I walk into this lab in the school that I was at the time, and it was very sterile, and the lab consultant was staring down at their computer screen and would not look up at me. And I had never used a computer at that point, so I was pretty freaked out by the whole thing. And I, like the students that Amanda described, I turned around and walked right out, because I was too scared to ask anybody. And that was not the experience that we wanted students to have with this lab, because it didn't look like a computer lab in many ways, because it looked more like a lounge. Students didn't realize that there was personnel there to help them. So one of the things that I had learned when I was at the CCLI was that if we train really good undergraduate students to model this behavior for the users, that the users will feel more at ease and understand that that space is a helping, generous space instead of an individualized, you're on your own kind of space. We spent about a year finding lab consultants where there had been none before, really, hiring students, hiring them for their good customer service skills rather than for their technological skills, because we can always train them on the technology. And that was one of the things that Amanda actually helped work with the most, because when she came on as a graduate student in the PhD program at Utah State, she became assistant lab director, working with me and with Ryan to help us implement the training. One of the most interesting things to me, I think, about starting the Suite Lab actually happened after I left. The summer of 2007 was when Amanda started seeking these more formal student reactions to the lab space, and she's going to talk about the usability tests that she conducted next.
Thanks, Cheryl. Yeah, so after a certain point, we realized we really wanted to know if students really were able to use this space more collaboratively than, well, we're able to use the space collaboratively at all. I mean, there's only so far we could get in sitting in the lab watching them or asking them. Students don't always know either, because they don't think the way that teachers think necessarily. They're not thinking about assessing spaces. They just want to get their work done, which is good for them. So we sought more formal student reactions by conducting a usability test, which is a way to see if the space is usable for a particular purpose. At the time, I was unable to actually find any other usability tests of spaces, so I had to take usability test protocol for documents and sort of adapt it. But I think it worked pretty well. So our goal of the usability test was to see, can students work on a collaborative assignment in this space and do it well? And so in this study, we set up the study with an intro to tech writing class, one of mine, and it was, of course, voluntary. And so for the task, we had them do a typical document design collaborative task. I believe they had to create a billboard for a company, write some copy for it, use some design, get some stuff off the internet, some images, that sort of thing. And they had 50 minutes, which typical class length for us. And I ended up putting them into 3 groups. The groups reflected basically our typical enrollment by gender. So we had 3 guys and 7 women. And that's pretty normal for us in our professional writing classes. One group worked with the desktops, and 2 groups had laptops. I gave them the task, and I videotaped them while they were doing the task, and then I gave them a post-test questionnaire about the task and how it went, and collected data that way. And we learned some pretty important things, really. First, we saw that desktops and laptops really have different purposes in the lab. They're both important, definitely. Like, at this point, I'm not sure I would ever recommend getting rid of all desktops in a computer lab. There's still a place for desktops, but for our purposes for collaboration, the laptops were much more useful. When we had the desktop group, when we watched on the video, and when I read their responses and their feedback to the test, they worked differently than the people with the laptops. We had 4 people, and they all crowded around one desktop computer, which is actually pretty typical of the classes I've seen working on a group project, which meant that one person was sitting at the keyboard, inputting all of the data, finding stuff on the internet, and the other people were giving them ideas, giving them some feedback. They were also sitting, in my opinion, and in the opinion of some people on the questionnaires, uncomfortably close so that they could do this. And anytime somebody wanted to, say, go search on the internet themselves, they had to physically stand up and go leave the group and go to another desktop computer where their view of the rest of the group was blocked. And so, and the differences between that and the laptop groups is the laptop groups were able to split up the tasks. They could sit right next to each other, well, comfortably speaking, right next to each other. They were able to establish those physical boundaries a little bit better because they could turn their laptops and show people when they had stuff that they wanted them to see instead of having them sit super close so they could see the screen. And they split up the work so that nobody had to actually leave the group physically to do the task that they were supposed to do. They emailed things back and forth, and they were also ultimately faster, although completing a document faster doesn't necessarily mean it's any better. And really, in the end, it's hard to say whether one of the documents was better than the other documents. That wasn't really one of the focuses of the test. And also, another outcome we learned that was very important was that from the video, nobody moved, well, except for nobody moved anything besides the wheelie computer chairs that are obviously on wheels, and we're used to having chairs like that move around. Nobody moved any of our little cylinder tables for the laptops. They didn't move any of the couch-like chairs. They just plopped themselves down and forced themselves to work around the computers. So they didn't feel like they had this sense of ownership. They didn't feel like they could move the space, and they said so in their questionnaires too. They said things like, well, it would have helped with collaboration if the chairs had been set up differently. Well, they didn't know, and I asked them, did you realize you could move these things? And they're like, oh, no. And that's just part of the common lab ideology. There's this higher power that designs the lab, and we have to make it work for us, and we can't do anything about it. And so we learned that our students need to have a sense of ownership over this space before they can use it like we really want them to use it. They need to realize, hey, they can take the power, move a chair, move that table, talk out loud. They don't have to whisper necessarily. I mean, don't be obtrusive to other people. And the LabCons really were instrumental in doing this. They were modeling this behavior, rearranging the lab so that when students came back on different days, it was just set up differently, which sort of visually suggests, hey, well, somebody must have moved this. Maybe it was some other students. Or just going up to students and even just flat out telling them, you know, you can move that table if it's not working for you. And they're, oh, okay. And so, and after a while, this sort of became more ingrained, too, with the evolution of the lab. And so, Cheryl, would you like to talk to detail about how these lessons that we learned sort of relate back to the outcomes that Jeannie talked about earlier?
Yeah, I want to go back to those for a second. Like Amanda said, students didn't see the usability of the lab until after we did this usability testing for them. So the idea of user-centered design and making sure that we're actually designing the spaces not only for users, but in ways that users realize they can be used. In this case, having that team-based learning set up, having breaking the concept of an old lab model in which the labs are quiet and users are working individually to a new lab environment, which might be noisy or collaborative, where the teams are using. One of the changes that Amanda and Ryan made after the usability study was to put up signs to showcase the fact that there were laptops available because they were in one of those moods, one of the laptop charging carts, and so students wouldn't always know at first that they were there. They also put up signs to indicate that the furniture, could be rearranged. This idea of reinforcing that the design is meant for the students to have agency over it was an important lesson for both us and for the students using the space. Secondly, the LabCons, modeling the social behavior, again, moving away from that genius model of writing where people are working individually into understanding that writing is collaborative, it's iterative, and that's a real-world writing practice. Writing in most every situation in the world never happens in complete solitude or in isolation. We also learned, and that the LabCons are there to help with that process. It is writing is a social process, as we say in writing studies. Providing the training to the consultants to be able to help with these traditional tasks morphed over the years, and when we would figure out how lab consultants could best work with the students. We ended up, I think Amanda said earlier, we ended up hiring more females to be lab consultants because it broke one of the gender barriers, first, of assuming that a computer lab is going to be mostly made up of males, but also because most of our students at the undergraduate level were female, just because of the kind of population that we were serving. And so we wanted our lab cons to reflect that. And then finally, the space, the lessons that we learned about the space. Again, we put up signs to suggest that we could move furniture, but we also changed the setup of the furniture periodically ourselves. We would ask the lab consultants to go in and rearrange stuff periodically so that students wouldn't get too comfortable in one location, but also to signal to them that they could own the space, that it was their space to do something with. And this, again, is the way that writing doesn't happen necessarily in one static place once it gets out, once students get out into the world. So we're going to break there again to see if y'all have any questions before we move into the third part.
This is Jeannie. I'll ask a question. What is the sequence? You call this a lab, and does that assume that there is a formal sit down in one place and look at the lecturer that precedes, or that the lab is part of a sequence of learning opportunities? Or is it just a single, this is what you're assigned for?
It's definitely, the Suite Lab and the pictures that we've been showing you are from a classroom, they're from an open lab, which is a drop-in kind of writing situation for students. Next, we're going to show you some pictures of what happened to the classroom space that was next door, and how that got remodeled as well eventually. But the open lab really was intended so that teachers could assign work in a classroom that may or may not have technology, and then after class the students could go into the Suite Lab to work on that, either in their groups or individually or with the consultants or in whatever frame that they needed. The ironic thing is that teachers ended up really liking the flexibility and the mobility of the space, and so they would start scheduling their classes in the open lab, which limited the number of lab hours that we could have. So that's part of why the department ended up, they funded the second classroom to be redone so that teachers wouldn't have to schedule their work in the open lab.
Other questions from the field? I think you can move right on then.
Okay. Amanda, I'll navigate for you if you want.
Okay, that sounds excellent. So at this point, we're going to talk about the impact that this space really had, and I'm going to delve into some of my dissertation research to get a lot of chance to talk to people about that, and I like that. So it really did have an impact on students. First of all, students, the department, us, and the community of peers, and we're going to go into all of those things in this section. First, we're going to talk about students. So student impact. Really, first off, and this is partially from personal experience, but also survey information, that this lab really built a sense of community amongst our students. It gave them a neutral space to gather and work on things or talk about things that wasn't really governed by anyone. I mean, yes, there were people in charge of the space, but we were very careful about making our LabCons not like this higher power of authority who's going to shush you all the time, for instance. And so that sense of community was really built, and it fostered relationships between faculty and students because, like I said before, it was this neutral space. I found myself in the lab all the time, and partially that's because my research was in there, but also because it was much more inviting than my office space, and students were much more willing to come up to me and talk to me and ask me questions when I was in the lab. Also, and so to determine, though, were students really collaborating in the lab? Besides my usability test, or our usability test, sorry, that was performed, I also did a survey during my dissertation research, because I wanted to know, so when students come to campus and they want to collaborate on a project, where are they going? And if they need computers, where are they going? What labs are they using? Because to me, this would suggest that if they were choosing the Suite lab, that meant we were doing something right, that maybe other places weren't doing so well. And so first I surveyed students because I wanted to know how many students even work together in labs. Like, is it something that there's a need for? And yes, 65% reported doing this activity or wanting to do this activity in a lab, whether they could or not. So yes, there was this need for collaboration in a lab space. It made sense, and they weren't just all doing it at home. They wanted to be able to go someplace and do this. And so I surveyed them, and I asked them, so what labs on campus are you choosing for these activities? And so the Suite lab was narrowly beat out by the library. The library came in at 44% of people chose the library, and 41% chose the Suite lab. However, we have to understand that the library has a lot of uses that the Suite lab really can't support because of our, well, size of the lab. We can't have separate study rooms for groups because we just don't have the capacity for that in our little bitty space, for instance. And so, yeah, it makes sense that some students would want that, and so they'd go to the library. Of course,
and
when I asked—
the library has a coffee shop. Yeah. Sorry.
Yes,
the library has a coffee shop.
We did have a vending machine. Although maybe it wasn't necessarily as good. I would agree with you there. However, but then I asked people when they were in these places, what were they using it for? Because I was like, okay, well, you say that you're going to go there for collaboration, but what are you actually doing when you get there? 73% of the people in the Suite lab said that they ended up using it for collaboration, whereas only 57% of people who were in the library said they ended up collaborating while they were there. So I decided that meant that the Suite lab must be pretty useful for collaboration then. And yes, this was a limited study because there's only so many people I can survey, but it was about 250 respondents, I believe. And so we can see that it really had a big impact on students. It gave them a place to go. And I think that's really useful in the end. And so, oops, sorry, I accidentally clicked ahead too far.
Right.
So we can see, too, and with the success of that open lab redesign, like Cheryl talked about, the department decided they wanted to do the classroom across the hall, which Cheryl and Ryan had wanted to redesign earlier but couldn't afford to with the grant money. Because that was really how this became a suite, 2 rooms instead of just 1 room, so people would know that even though we were in the English department, we didn't mess up what the word suite meant. So, and with that success, we wrote and received another grant, and so we redesigned this computer classroom so that our faculty could teach in there, and so that students really, it didn't clash with them. They didn't have to go from the really awesome computer lab into the sort of drab computer classroom to have class then. That would be sort of a downer. And so the redesign of this room involved laptops. We got rid of the desktop completely and mobile furniture. So the tables in this one moved too because we don't have desktops that are on them so we can move them around. We witnessed a shift in the pedagogy that happened in this space, definitely, which is how I would say this room had a department impact. Well, the other room did too. The Suite lab as a whole, departmental impact. For instance, I noticed when I was teaching in these rooms that students tended to take more initiative for whatever reason, like the sense of ownership they had over the space across the hall sort of extended into the space here. For instance, they became more likely to ask other students for help when they had a question on a design task rather than just automatically raising their hand and asking me. They were much more likely just to sort of group up and kind of help each other. And also, let's see, teachers are more likely to move these tables around like they were intended to be moved. I mean, we see it set up in the pod formation here, but that is obviously not the only way we could do it. They can be in rows. They could be set up all around the room. We also managed to, that's why we had this sort of trapezoid tables so they would fit together pretty well. And along the top of the room, because this is a 1918 building, it obviously didn't have that great of wiring. We had facilities put in electrical outlets on the ceiling so that we could plug our laptops in to make the laptops be able to last longer, even after the battery sort of started to fade, because that is one of the drawbacks of laptops is that they need to be plugged in sometimes. But when you're moving around, that's hard. I also witnessed students they just took more control. Instructors, for instance, wanted their students to sit in rows one day. I saw this, an instructor wanted their students in rows one day, but it was already set up in pods, and the students were like, well, I don't think that's the best idea for this. And they explained it, and then finally the instructor said, okay, I think you have a pretty good point. We'll stay in pods. And so that sort of initiative is really what we want to see our students taking. They have power over their learning. They're active learners, and I think that's really important. And I think our space fosters that. However, in order to do that, I mean, sometimes you have to be a change agent and make these things happen. And Cheryl, would you like to talk some more about that?
Yeah, one of the important lessons for us individually as the instigators of this change was to know that faculty members can, and even graduate students, as Amanda was, can make change within a department. It's important to remember that this was a departmentally owned space to begin with, but oftentimes, you know, I meet a lot of faculty members who go and they work in a space and their pedagogy doesn't fit it, but they like force their pedagogy into a particular space. And I think a lot of people don't understand that, like, they can ask questions, they can get on committees, they can work towards these changes, even if there isn't always money at first. I mean, when I think back at my time at Utah State, I came in my first semester, I was asked to teach a video editing class, but my class was scheduled in a room with no computers and there were no video cameras. So at that point, I had to become a change agent for the department, and they wanted me to do that. Sometimes it takes a little bit more subtle changes, though, before things can happen. But this change with the Suite Lab is one of many happening within writing labs across the U.S. Like I mentioned the CCLI earlier, that lab is over 30 years old, and it's gone through a recent redesign. Now it's called the Humanities Digital Media Zone, the DMZ, which kind of cracks me up. And the new director, Aaron Smith, has been working for the last 2 years to redevelop this site into something that's really quite both collaborative and high-tech and multimedia intensive. And you can see from the shapes of the desks that it's pretty innovative and funky, and that's exactly the kind of atmosphere that university and the Humanities Department at Michigan Tech has always promoted. So they are redeveloping their own site to be another award-winning site. The Digital Media Project at Ohio State is another lab, and here all you see are the couches, but off behind the couches are a couple of high-end computers. The DMP was started by another faculty member, Scott DeWitt, who had actually attended a summer workshop that they used to have at Michigan Tech and had seen the CCLI space there. So here you start to see iterations of other labs that are taking on this writing, networked writing infrastructure, but making it more homey and more comfortable. And of course, the Knoll Studio at Eastern Kentucky is a beautiful space if you haven't been there yet. I highly recommend it. It's this two-story atrium built into the old library there where they have creativity rooms and whiteboards and the whole gamut. It's just a lovely, collaborative, pedagogically driven space. And then I just wanted to show one picture of a lab that I was redesigned that I was somewhat involved with here at my local institution, now Illinois State. We have this publications unit that's responsible for doing print-based nonprofit publishing, and they have a class in there. This lab only holds, it's a tiny room, it only held like 10 computers, and it were in a perimeter arrangement until recently, and the computers were old iMacs. because there wasn't money and there wasn't time and there wasn't, the budget to redevelop this. But after a year or two of the Assistant Director, Steve Holly, working with the Director, Tara, and myself and some of the IT people at ISU, we managed to come up with a budget that through end of the year variance, we were able to get new pod arrangements, a new instructor station, a new smart board. So making small changes and patience really, we found, goes a long way. So we'll stop there to take any more questions you have. I see that Andrew has a question here. Andrew, do you want to ask that question? Oh, he's logging out. Okay. He asked, do we coordinate the software image on the lab computers? Oh, not in all cases. Most of these labs that we're talking about, the IT for the department does the software image, it's not a university-wide thing. I know that that's changing it at OSU somewhat, but yeah, it's usually done departmentally specific.
This is Jeannie. Talk a little bit about the relationship you had with the physical plant officer who was nice enough to drill holes in the ceiling or whatever he did or she did, and the kind of the IT people and just the culture and climate for let's try something new, but really the nuts and bolts things too of helping you get it done.
Yes, this was definitely crucial. So, like Amanda said, the building at Rapey West was from 1918. So when we came into that building, at first there were nothing but power strips, and I'm sure OSHA would have had a nightmare if they'd come into that room in order to make everything run, and it wasn't. Everything was based on the perimeter, so sometimes the perimeter arrangement for the computer lab is based solely on where the electrical outlets are located. I had that experience again recently in redesigning a suite of 8 computer labs that support writing intensive instruction at ISU, and we went back and forth with facilities management to say, okay, we understand that these outlets are on the outside of the wall, but we need to do this pod or this peninsula arrangement where the computers are coming in, so we need to make sure that we buy cables that we can string together electrically in order to support this pedagogy. Like, we cannot have the pedagogy tied to the walls, literally. And one of my roles as a faculty member coming in and getting hired into an institution is to speak with the IT people to see what their philosophy is about pedagogy. And I've worked with enough places to know that if somebody in instructional technology or in information technology is totally unwilling to listen to me talk about pedagogy and for me to come to them with questions about it, then it may not be a place that I want to work. Which is a rough question, to have to address, but it's also an important question that communication can be reciprocal. Mm-hmm. That was sort of a meta answer to your question, I guess, Jean.
Okay. Well, we don't have any more questions, but I'm going to, and I want the audience to know, the participants to know, this is not a scripted question. So since you're rhetorician, how do you pronounce that word?
Rhetors, yeah.
Rhetoricians. you deal with rhetoric. Would you, if you were starting out again, would you come up with a different name than Sweet Lab?
Oh, can I answer this?
Sure.
I'm actually a fan of the Sweet Lab because of the play on the word sweet, S-W-E-E-T, which we actually sort of played up a lot during the, while we were there because, it was a sweet place to work. So I kind of like it.
Okay. I'll go with that, Amanda, and I think I speak for the whole group of participants here to say thanks to the two of you and remind everyone that their conversation will be posted and available to you in the next couple of days or by the end of the week or something like that. And it's both the audio and the video, and so we look forward to your comments on this and one of the best lessons learned. And we're going to be packaging up the set of classroom learning spaces webinars and kind of reorganizing them in a way that will help everybody. So, oh, you have one more slide to show they get the last word.
Oh, well, we just wanted to thank everybody for their time today, and just remind you that changes in space help us facilitate our pedagogy. So thank you for having us.
You're very, very welcome. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye-bye. Bye.